Marcus Thompson had lived in Willowbrook Estates for 15 peaceful years. The quiet suburban neighborhood with its tree-lined streets and well-maintained lawns had always been his sanctuary after long days at the engineering firm. His modest two-story house sat on a corner lot, and like every other resident, he had a standard black mailbox positioned near the curb. Everything changed when Linda Patterson moved into the house directly across from his. Within her first week, she had already introduced herself as the newly elected president of the Homeowners Association. Linda was a woman in her early 50s with perfectly styled blonde hair and a wardrobe that screamed authority. She carried herself with the confidence of someone who believed rules existed solely for her to enforce. The trouble started on a Tuesday morning in early spring. Marcus was sipping his coffee and reading emails when he noticed Linda standing by his mailbox, clipboard in hand, taking notes. Through his kitchen window, he watched as she measured the distance between his mailbox and the street with a small tape measure. She spent nearly 10 minutes examining every detail, from the height to the exact positioning. Curious about her strange behavior, Marcus walked outside to greet his new neighbor. Linda barely acknowledged his friendly hello before launching into a lecture about mailbox regulations. According to her interpretation of the HOA guidelines, his mailbox was positioned 3 inches too close to the street and violated the community standards that everyone had agreed to follow when purchasing their homes. Marcus politely explained that his mailbox had been in the exact same spot for 15 years, installed by the previous homeowner and approved by the Postal Service. He mentioned that he had never received any complaints from neighbors, mail carriers, or previous HOA boards. Linda dismissed his explanations with a wave of her hand, stating that previous oversight didn't excuse current violations. She handed him a formal notice typed on official HOA letterhead, demanding that he relocate his mailbox within 30 days or face daily fines starting at $50. The notice included references to obscure subsections of the community guidelines that Marcus had never heard of, despite being a longtime resident who had always followed the rules. That evening, Marcus called his neighbor and longtime friend Robert Chen, who had served on the HOA board for several years. Robert was shocked to hear about Linda's demands and immediately offered to review the community guidelines. After spending 2 hours going through every document, Robert confirmed that Marcus's mailbox was perfectly compliant with all established regulations. The next morning, Robert accompanied Marcus to speak with Linda about the misunderstanding. They found her power washing her driveway while wearing a pristine white outfit that somehow remained spotless. When they approached with friendly smiles and documentation, proving the mailbox was compliant, Linda's response surprised them both. She insisted that the previous guidelines were outdated and insufficient for maintaining the high standards that Willowbrook Estates deserved. As the new HOA president, she had implemented updated interpretations of existing rules to ensure the neighborhood maintained its property values and aesthetic appeal. According to Linda, Marcus's mailbox created an unsightly obstruction that could potentially impact everyone's home values. Marcus remained calm and respectful, suggesting they could resolve the issue by having the entire HOA board review the guidelines together. Linda responded by informing him that she had already discussed the matter with the other board members, and they had unanimously agreed that his mailbox needed to be relocated. She refused to provide any documentation of this supposed board meeting or vote. Over the following days, Marcus reached out to the other 4 board members individually. To his amazement, none of them had heard anything about updated mailbox regulations or participated in any vote regarding his property. 2 of the board members admitted they were afraid to challenge Linda's decisions because she had threatened to pursue legal action against anyone who questioned her authority. The situation escalated when Linda began taking daily photographs of Marcus's mailbox and leaving additional violation notices. Each notice demanded immediate compliance and threatened increasingly severe consequences. She claimed to have contacted attorneys about pursuing legal action and suggested that Marcus's refusal to cooperate was damaging the entire community's reputation. Marcus realized he was dealing with someone who had no intention of being reasonable or following proper procedures. Linda had appointed herself as the ultimate authority over the neighborhood and expected everyone to submit to her demands without question. Her behavior went far beyond normal HOA oversight and crossed into harassment territory. Despite feeling frustrated and targeted, Marcus decided to document everything carefully. He took photographs of his mailbox from multiple angles, saved all of Linda's violation notices, and began keeping a detailed log of her daily visits to his property. He also researched the legal requirements for HOA enforcement actions and discovered that Linda had violated numerous procedures in her attempt to force him to relocate his mailbox. As the 30-day deadline approached, Marcus knew he needed to take action. Linda had made it clear that she intended to impose daily fines and escalate her harassment campaign until he submitted to her demands. The other residents were watching the situation unfold, and many of them were concerned about Linda's aggressive approach to neighborhood management. Marcus had always been a patient and methodical person, qualities that had served him well in his engineering career. He began formulating a plan that would not only resolve the mailbox issue, but also address Linda's broader pattern of overreach and intimidation. The time had come to teach the neighborhood tyrant that actions have consequences and that homeowners have rights that cannot be trampled by power-hungry HOA presidents. Marcus spent his weekend researching HOA laws and regulations with the same methodical approach he used for engineering projects. He discovered that Linda had made several critical errors in her enforcement attempts. First, she had never followed the proper notification procedures outlined in the community bylaws. Second, she had failed to provide him with a formal hearing opportunity before imposing fines. Most importantly, she had misrepresented the board's position by claiming unanimous support for decisions that were never actually made. On Monday morning, Marcus submitted a formal complaint to the property management company that administered the HOA's daily operations. He included photographs, documentation, and a detailed timeline of Linda's harassment campaign. The property manager, Janet Williams, was horrified to learn about the situation and immediately began investigating Linda's actions. Janet discovered that Linda had been acting without proper board approval for most of her decisions since becoming president. She had also been intercepting official HOA correspondence and making unilateral policy changes that exceeded her authority. The property management company had received several complaints from other residents about Linda's aggressive enforcement tactics, but this was the first formal documentation of her misconduct. Meanwhile, Linda escalated her campaign against Marcus by recruiting other residents to support her position. She organized a neighborhood meeting at her house, claiming that Marcus's defiance was setting a dangerous precedent that could lead to community chaos. She painted herself as a dedicated volunteer working to protect everyone's property values against a stubborn homeowner who refused to follow basic rules. However, Linda's strategy backfired when several longtime residents attended the meeting and challenged her claims. They pointed out that Marcus had always been a model neighbor who maintained his property beautifully and contributed positively to the community. Some residents revealed that Linda had been pressuring them to support various enforcement actions against other neighbors for minor infractions. Robert Chen attended the meeting and presented documentation proving that Marcus's mailbox was fully compliant with all established regulations. He also revealed that Linda had never called an official board meeting to discuss the mailbox issue, despite claiming board support for her enforcement action. The revelation shocked the assembled residents and exposed Linda's dishonesty. Linda responded to the mounting opposition by doubling down on her position. She accused Robert of conspiring with Marcus to undermine legitimate HOA authority and threatened to pursue legal action against both of them. She claimed that their resistance to her leadership was creating a hostile environment that could expose the HOA to liability issues. The situation reached a breaking point when Linda began leaving daily violation notices on Marcus's door, each one threatening immediate legal action and demanding thousands of dollars in accumulated fines. She also started taking photographs of other residents' properties, looking for additional violations she could use to demonstrate her enforcement authority. Marcus realized that Linda's behavior had crossed the line from annoying to potentially illegal harassment. He contacted a local attorney who specialized in HOA disputes and discovered that Linda had violated numerous laws in her enforcement attempts. The attorney agreed to represent Marcus on a contingency basis, confident that they had a strong case against both Linda personally and the HOA's insurance policy. During this time, Marcus also learned more about Linda's background from other neighbors. She had recently moved to Willowbrook Estates after being forced to sell her previous home due to financial difficulties. Several residents mentioned that she had been involved in disputes with neighbors at her previous address and had a reputation for being confrontational and demanding. The stress of the ongoing conflict was taking a toll on Marcus, but he refused to be intimidated into relocating a perfectly compliant mailbox. He had worked hard to build a peaceful life in Willowbrook Estates and wasn't about to let a power-hungry neighbor drive him out of his home. More importantly, he recognized that Linda's pattern of behavior would likely target other residents if she succeeded in bullying him into submission. Marcus began reaching out to his neighbors individually, sharing documentation about Linda's misconduct and encouraging them to attend the next official HOA board meeting. He was careful to stick to facts and avoid personal attacks, focusing on Linda's violations of proper procedures and her pattern of harassment. The response from his neighbors was overwhelmingly supportive. Many residents had been quietly concerned about Linda's aggressive approach, but had been afraid to speak up individually. They appreciated Marcus's calm, methodical documentation of the issues and were grateful that someone was finally standing up to Linda's unreasonable demands. As the situation developed, Marcus also discovered that Linda had been making unauthorized changes to the community's landscaping and common areas. She had hired contractors to perform work without proper board approval and had been billing the expenses to the HOA's general fund. These discoveries added weight to the growing case against her leadership. By the end of the second week, Marcus had assembled a coalition of concerned residents who were ready to challenge Linda's authority at the next board meeting. He had also gathered enough evidence of her misconduct to file formal complaints with both the property management company and the state agency that regulated HOA operations. Linda seemed to sense that the tide was turning against her, because she began making increasingly desperate threats about legal action and community consequences. She claimed that Marcus's resistance was inspiring other residents to ignore legitimate HOA regulations, and that the neighborhood was descending into chaos because of his defiance. However, Marcus remained focused on his long-term strategy. He knew that exposing Linda's misconduct would take time and patience, but he was confident that the truth would eventually prevail. The mailbox dispute had become about much more than property positioning. It was now a battle for the soul of the Willowbrook Estates community and the rights of homeowners to live peacefully without harassment from power-hungry officials. The official HOA board meeting was scheduled for Thursday evening at the community center, and Marcus knew this would be his opportunity to expose Linda's misconduct publicly. He spent several days preparing his presentation, organizing documents chronologically, and creating visual aids that would clearly demonstrate the pattern of harassment he had endured. Linda apparently sensed the danger, because she attempted to cancel the meeting at the last minute, claiming that not enough residents had submitted agenda items to warrant a formal gathering. However, the property management company informed her that state law required monthly meetings, and that she could not arbitrarily cancel them without proper cause. On the night of the meeting, the community center was packed with residents who had heard about the ongoing conflict. Many people who rarely attended HOA meetings showed up, curious to see how the mailbox dispute would be resolved. The tension in the room was obvious as Linda took her position at the head table, flanked by the other 4 board members who looked visibly uncomfortable. Marcus had requested time on the agenda to address his concerns about HOA enforcement procedures, carefully avoiding any personal attacks on Linda while focusing on documented violations of proper protocol. When his turn came to speak, he calmly presented a timeline of events, complete with photographs, copies of violation notices, and records of his attempts to resolve the issue through proper channels. The assembled residents listened in stunned silence as Marcus revealed the extent of Linda's misconduct. He showed how she had claimed board approval for decisions that were never made, violated notification requirements outlined in the community bylaws, and failed to provide due process opportunities before imposing fines. Most shocking was his documentation of Linda's daily harassment campaign and her threats of legal action against residents who questioned her authority. Linda attempted to interrupt Marcus's presentation several times, claiming that he was misrepresenting the facts and attacking her personal character. However, the other board members surprisingly supported Marcus's right to present his case without interruption. It became clear that they were also concerned about Linda's behavior, and grateful that someone was finally addressing the issues publicly. When Marcus finished his presentation, several other residents stood up to share their own experiences with Linda's enforcement tactics. Mrs. Rodriguez revealed that Linda had threatened her with fines for having too many flowers in her front yard. Mr. Patterson described how Linda had demanded he repaint his house because the existing color allegedly violated community standards. That didn't actually exist. The most damaging testimony came from Sarah Mitchell, a real estate agent who lived in the neighborhood. She revealed that Linda had been contacting potential buyers to warn them about various property violations, effectively sabotaging sales and damaging property values. This behavior directly contradicted Linda's claims that she was working to protect everyone's investments. As more residents shared their stories, a clear pattern emerged of Linda using her position to intimidate and harass neighbors over minor or non-existent violations. The other board members looked increasingly uncomfortable as they realized the extent of the problems Linda had created. During her brief tenure as president, Linda finally demanded the right to respond to what she called malicious attacks on her character and leadership. She stood up and delivered an angry speech about ungrateful residents who didn't appreciate her volunteer efforts to maintain community standards. She accused Marcus of organizing a conspiracy to undermine legitimate HOA authority and claimed that his mailbox violation was just the beginning of widespread rule-breaking. However, Linda's defensive response only made her look worse in front of the assembled residents. She became increasingly agitated as people challenged her claims with facts and documentation. When Robert Chen presented the official HOA guidelines proving that Marcus's mailbox was fully compliant, Linda accused him of falsifying documents and threatened to have him removed from the board. The meeting reached a climax when Janet Williams, the property management company representative, addressed the assembly about Linda's unauthorized actions. She revealed that Linda had been making policy changes without board approval, hiring contractors without proper authorization, and intercepting official correspondence. Most seriously, she had been accumulating expenses that the HOA's insurance company might not cover due to her failure to follow proper procedures. Several residents immediately called for Linda's resignation, but she refused to step down voluntarily. She claimed that the attacks against her were politically motivated and that removing her would set a dangerous precedent for future HOA leadership. She also threatened to pursue legal action against anyone who attempted to remove her from office without following proper procedures. Marcus had anticipated this possibility and had researched the recall procedures outlined in the community bylaws. He presented a motion to begin the formal process of removing Linda from the board, citing her violations of fiduciary duty and her pattern of harassment against residents. The motion required signatures from 20% of the homeowners to trigger a recall election. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Nearly 40 residents signed the recall petition that night, far exceeding the minimum requirement. Linda watched in shock as her neighbors lined up to support her removal, many of them people she had considered allies just weeks earlier. As the meeting concluded, Linda made one final desperate attempt to maintain control. She announced that she would be consulting with attorneys about the recall process and warned residents that removing her could expose them to legal liability. She also threatened to resign from all community volunteer activities, claiming that the neighborhood would suffer without her dedicated leadership. However, her threats fell on deaf ears. The residents had heard enough testimony about Linda's misconduct to know that her removal was necessary for the community's well-being. Many people approached Marcus after the meeting to thank him for his courage in standing up to Linda's bullying tactics. Marcus left the meeting feeling cautiously optimistic about the outcome, but he knew that Linda wouldn't give up easily. Her threats about legal action suggested that she might escalate the conflict rather than accept defeat gracefully. He prepared himself for whatever retaliation she might attempt while the recall process moved forward. Linda's reaction to the recall petition was swift and vindictive. The morning after the board meeting, Marcus discovered that someone had spray-painted the word troublemaker across his mailbox in bright red letters. Security cameras from a neighbor's house captured Linda's car parked near Marcus's property around 2 a.m, though the footage wasn't clear enough to show her actually vandalizing the mailbox. Marcus immediately filed a police report about the vandalism and shared the security footage with the investigating officer. While the evidence wasn't conclusive enough for criminal charges, It established a pattern of escalating harassment that would be useful in any future legal proceedings. Marcus also documented the damage with photographs and obtained repair estimates for potential civil action. Linda's behavior became increasingly erratic as the recall process moved forward. She began leaving rambling voicemails for board members at all hours, demanding emergency meetings to address what she called a homeowner rebellion. She also started a campaign to discredit Marcus by distributing flyers throughout the neighborhood that made wild accusations about his character and motivations. The flyers contained several false statements that bordered on libel, including claims that Marcus was a convicted criminal who was trying to undermine property values to buy additional homes at reduced prices. Linda also accused him of organizing a harassment campaign against elderly residents and suggested that his engineering background somehow made him a threat to community safety. Marcus's attorney advised him that Linda's behavior had crossed into potential criminal territory with the vandalism and definitely into civil liability with the defamatory flyers. They began documenting everything for a comprehensive lawsuit that would address both the harassment and the damage to Marcus's reputation. Meanwhile, the recall election was scheduled for the following month, and Linda mounted an increasingly desperate campaign to maintain her position. She organized coffee meetings with small groups of residents, trying to convince them that Marcus was a dangerous troublemaker who would destroy the neighborhood's harmony if his rebellion succeeded. However, Linda's strategy backfired because many residents were put off by her increasingly paranoid and aggressive rhetoric. Her claims about Marcus became so outlandish that even her initial supporters began to question her mental state. Several people mentioned to Marcus that Linda seemed to be having some kind of breakdown under the pressure. The situation took an unexpected turn when Linda hired a local attorney and sent cease and desist letters to Marcus and several other residents who had supported the recall petition. The letters claimed that the recall process violated her civil rights and that continuing with the election would expose the signers to personal liability for damages. Marcus's attorney reviewed Linda's cease and desist letter and determined that it had no legal merit whatsoever. The recall process was clearly outlined in the community bylaws, and residents had an absolute right to petition for the removal of board members who violated their duties. Linda's attorney had apparently taken her money without properly investigating the legal basis for her claims. The cease and desist letters actually helped Marcus's cause because they demonstrated Linda's continued abuse of her position and her willingness to threaten residents with frivolous legal action. Several people who had been on the fence about the recall decided to support Linda's removal after receiving threatening letters about exercising their legitimate rights as homeowners. As the recall election approached, Linda made increasingly desperate attempts to generate support for her position. She claimed that removing her would leave the community vulnerable to lawsuits from disgruntled residents and suggested that property values would plummet without her strong leadership. She also spread rumors that Marcus was planning to run for HOA president himself and would implement radical changes that would damage the neighborhood's character. Marcus had no interest in serving on the HOA board and made this clear to anyone who asked. His only goal was removing Linda from a position where she could continue harassing innocent residents. He had learned that several other neighborhoods had experienced similar problems with Linda in the past, suggesting that her behavior was part of a long-standing pattern rather than an isolated incident. The recall election was held on a Saturday morning at the community center, with independent monitors from the property management company overseeing the process. Despite Linda's efforts to rally support, the results were decisive. 73% of participating residents voted to remove her from the board immediately. Linda's response to her overwhelming defeat was both predictable and concerning. She refused to accept the election results and demanded a recount, claiming that Marcus had somehow manipulated the voting process. When the property management company confirmed that the election had been conducted properly, Linda accused them of being part of the conspiracy against her. The drama reached its peak when Linda showed up at Marcus's house that evening, demanding that he admit to orchestrating a fraudulent election and threatening to expose his criminal conspiracy to law enforcement. Marcus, who had been expecting some kind of confrontation, had positioned security cameras around his property and recorded the entire encounter. The video showed Linda making increasingly wild accusations, while Marcus remained calm and asked her to leave his property. When she refused, Marcus called the police and had her removed for trespassing. The footage also captured Linda making several statements that could be considered threatening, providing additional evidence for potential legal action. Linda's final act as HOA president was to drain the community's reserve fund into her personal account, claiming that the money was owed to her for legal fees and emotional damages suffered during the recall process. This obvious theft was discovered within days and reported to both law enforcement and the state agency that regulated HOA operations. Marcus realized that Linda's behavior had spiraled completely out of control and that she now faced serious legal consequences for her actions. The theft of HOA funds was a felony that could result in prison time, especially combined with her pattern of harassment and intimidation. The mailbox dispute that had started the entire conflict seemed almost trivial compared to the crimes Linda had committed in her desperate attempt to maintain power. The discovery of Linda's theft sent shockwaves through Willowbrook Estates. The property management company immediately contacted law enforcement and initiated an emergency audit of all HOA financial accounts. What they found was even worse than initially suspected. Linda had been systematically draining funds for weeks, using various fabricated expenses and unauthorized contractor payments to cover her tracks. Marcus found himself in the unusual position of being the neighborhood hero, with residents stopping by daily to thank him for his persistence in exposing Linda's corruption. Many people admitted they had suspected something was wrong with Linda's leadership, but hadn't known how to address their concerns effectively. They credited Marcus with having the courage to stand up when others were too intimidated to act. The police investigation moved quickly once they had access to the financial records. Detective Sarah Morrison, who specialized in white-collar crimes, discovered that Linda had stolen nearly $15,000 from the HOA's accounts over a 6-week period. The money had been used to pay her personal legal fees, cover her mortgage payments, and fund her campaign against the recall election. Linda's attorney immediately withdrew from representing her once the theft charges were filed, apparently unwilling to defend someone who had been using stolen money to pay legal fees. Linda was forced to hire a public defender and quickly discovered that her legal options were extremely limited given the overwhelming evidence against her. The criminal charges were just the beginning of Linda's legal problems. Marcus's attorney filed a comprehensive civil lawsuit seeking damages for harassment, defamation, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. The lawsuit also named the HOA's insurance company as a defendant, arguing that Linda's actions while serving as president created liability for the organization. Several other residents joined the lawsuit as additional plaintiffs, documenting their own experiences with Linda's harassment and intimidation tactics. The collective legal action painted a picture of systematic abuse of power that went far beyond the original mailbox dispute. Linda faced potential financial ruin even if she somehow avoided prison time. The state agency that regulated HOA operations launched their own investigation into Linda's conduct and the property management company's oversight failures. They discovered that Linda had violated numerous regulations governing HOA board behavior and had exposed the community to significant liability through her unauthorized actions. As the legal proceedings moved forward, more details about Linda's background emerged that explained her erratic behavior. Court documents revealed that she had filed for bankruptcy twice in the previous 5 years and had been involved in similar disputes with neighbors at her previous addresses. Her financial desperation apparently motivated her theft of HOA funds. Marcus also learned that Linda had been evicted from her rental apartment before moving to Willowbrook Estates and had used falsified financial documents to qualify for her mortgage. Her entire life appeared to be built on deception and manipulation, with the HOA presidency representing just another opportunity to exploit others for personal gain. The criminal trial began 3 months after Linda's arrest, and Marcus was called as a key witness to testify about the harassment campaign that had precipitated the recall election. He presented his meticulously documented timeline of events, including photographs, recordings, and copies of all threatening communications he had received. Linda's defense attorney attempted to portray her as a dedicated volunteer who had been overwhelmed by the responsibilities of HOA leadership and had made some poor decisions under stress. However, the prosecution's evidence of systematic theft and deliberate harassment made this defense strategy ineffective. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before finding Linda guilty on all charges, including theft, harassment, and abuse of her fiduciary duties as HOA president. The judge sentenced her to 18 months in prison and ordered her to pay full restitution to the HOA plus additional fines and court costs. Linda's house was quickly put up for sale to satisfy her legal obligations, and she was required to move out of Willowbrook Estates as a condition of her probation. The restraining order Marcus had obtained during the civil proceedings was extended to ensure that Linda could never return to harass residents in the future. The civil lawsuit was settled out of court for a substantial sum that covered Marcus's legal fees and provided compensation for the emotional distress he had suffered during Linda's harassment campaign. The other plaintiff residents also received settlements that reflected the damages they had experienced. The HOA's insurance company ultimately covered most of the financial losses from Linda's theft and the legal settlements, though they implemented new oversight procedures to prevent similar situations in the future. The property management company also enhanced their monitoring systems and established clearer protocols for addressing complaints about board member misconduct. Robert Chen was elected as the new HOA president in a special election, and his first official act was to formally apologize to Marcus and the other residents who had been targeted by Linda's harassment. The new board implemented policies to ensure transparency and accountability in all future enforcement actions. Marcus's mailbox, which had started the entire conflict, remained exactly where it had always been, in full compliance with all applicable regulations. Linda's desperate attempt to assert control over a perfectly legal installation had ultimately led to her complete downfall and removal from the community she had tried to dominate. 6 months after Linda's sentencing, Willowbrook Estates had transformed into a genuinely peaceful and cooperative community. The new HOA board, led by Robert Chen, implemented transparent procedures and focused on actual community improvements rather than petty enforcement actions. Property values in the neighborhood actually increased once potential buyers learned that the previous toxic leadership had been removed. Marcus found himself unexpectedly famous when a local news station picked up the story of his successful battle against HOA corruption. The reporter was fascinated by how a simple mailbox dispute had exposed systematic fraud and led to criminal convictions. The story went viral on social media, with thousands of people sharing their own experiences with abusive HOA officials. The publicity generated speaking opportunities for Marcus at community organizations and homeowner advocacy groups throughout the region. He used these platforms to educate residents about their rights and the proper procedures for addressing HOA misconduct. His calm, methodical approach to confronting corruption became a model for other communities facing similar challenges. Linda's criminal conviction had broader consequences beyond her personal punishment. The state legislature used her case as evidence for the need for stronger regulations governing HOA operations. New laws were passed requiring better financial oversight, clearer procedures for addressing complaints, and mandatory training for board members. The property management company that had failed to detect Linda's early misconduct also faced scrutiny from regulators and clients. They implemented comprehensive reforms to their oversight procedures and hired additional staff to monitor HOA compliance with state regulations. The company used the Willowbrook Estates case as a training example for identifying warning signs of board member abuse. Marcus received periodic updates about Linda's situation through the probation system. She had been released from prison after serving 12 months but remained under court supervision and was required to make monthly restitution payments to the HOA. Her criminal record made finding employment difficult, and she had relocated to another state to start over. The mailbox that had triggered the entire conflict became something of a neighborhood landmark. Visitors to Willowbrook Estates were often shown the infamous mailbox and told the story of how one resident's refusal to be bullied had saved an entire community from corruption. The mailbox itself remained completely unchanged, standing as a symbol of resistance to authoritarian overreach. Marcus's meticulous documentation during the conflict proved to be invaluable not just for his own case but for other residents facing similar situations. He created a template for recording HOA harassment that was shared online and helped dozens of homeowners build cases against abusive board members in other communities. The success of the recall election inspired other neighborhoods to examine their own HOA leadership more critically. Several communities in the surrounding area discovered their own instances of financial misconduct or harassment by board members and used the Willowbrook Estates case as a roadmap for addressing these problems. Marcus often reflected on how different the outcome might have been if he had simply given in to Linda's initial demands and moved his mailbox. Her success in bullying him would likely have emboldened her to target other residents and possibly escalate her theft of community funds. By standing firm on principle, he had inadvertently protected the entire neighborhood from ongoing victimization. The attorney who represented Marcus in the civil lawsuit noted that the case had become a textbook example of how to properly document and pursue legal action against HOA misconduct. The comprehensive evidence Marcus had gathered made the legal proceedings much more straightforward than typical homeowner disputes, which often lack proper documentation. Robert Chen's leadership as the new HOA president focused on healing the divisions that Linda's reign had created within the community. He organized social events that brought residents together and established committees that gave everyone a voice in neighborhood decisions. The contrast with Linda's authoritarian approach was striking and appreciated by all. The insurance settlement that compensated Marcus and other affected residents sent a clear message to other HOA boards about the financial risks of tolerating abusive behavior. Several insurance companies began requiring anti-harassment training for board members and implementing stricter oversight of communities with complaint histories. Marcus eventually wrote a detailed account of his experience that was published in a homeowner advocacy magazine. The article provided a step-by-step guide for residents facing similar situations and emphasized the importance of knowing your rights and documenting everything carefully. The piece became one of the magazine's most requested reprints. Years later, Marcus still lived happily in Willowbrook Estates, which had become known as one of the best-managed HOA communities in the region. His original goal of simply being left alone to live peacefully had been achieved, along with the unexpected bonus of helping create positive changes that benefited homeowners throughout the state. The mailbox that started it all continued to receive mail delivery without incident, positioned exactly 3 inches closer to the street than Linda had deemed acceptable. Sometimes Marcus would look at it while drinking his morning coffee and smile, remembering how a power-hungry neighbor's obsession with control had ultimately led to her complete downfall. The priceless revenge hadn't required any scheming or manipulation on his part, just the patience to let Linda's own actions expose her true character to the entire community.